Hi, I'm Dr. Walter Dorn, and I'm very glad to offer this presentation at the Congress of Humanities and Social Sciences as part of the meeting of the Canadian Peace Research Association. Now, I'm going to speak on the global governance of security, looking at the evolution of ideas and institutions. And I'll draw upon the past in order to inform the plans for the future. I take an evolutionary and historical approach because it shows the main features of global governments as they emerged. I think the best way to introduce the main elements is to show how they were established. It shows the progress and the setbacks of humanity in the struggle for civility and good governance. And by showing progress, I think we can give direction to the future. The tensions of the past still exist today, but global norms, treaties, and evolutions have slowly evolved, and they should not be taken for granted. And they still have a long way to go until we reach our goals, which should be security for one and all. Now let me switch to the PowerPoint presentation. So humanity comes from a very dark past in which empires have fought each other, from the ancient Greeks to the Second World War. We've seen nations taking up arms and trying to conquer. We had a very dark period in the Middle Ages whereby there was such brutality in fighting, and conquest was recognized as a legitimate right of kings who ruled under some sort of divine permission. We saw even in the Napoleonic Wars, where wars were fought in the name of the people, that there was massive destruction across the battlefields of Europe. And it was at the end of those Napoleonic Wars that the Congress of Vienna met in 1815 in order to come up with a peace plan for Europe, a long-term plan. And the best that the diplomats gathered in Vienna could do is to come up with the concept of a balance of power, so that no one nation like France would dare to challenge the security of Europe. And so they created a concert of Europe, whereby nations would come together on occasion when it was necessary to discuss the means to create a peace in Europe. And that held roughly for 100 years. And it allowed at least for a means of communication. But it was what I call global governance zero. That is the first, not even the first generation of global governance. It was a means just for discussions and based on a faulty principle of balance of power. However, some progress was made in the second half of the 19th century. In 1865, the International Telegraph Union was formed so that nations could communicate with each other through this new device, the telegraph, and understand the signals sent from one country to another, like Morse code. And then the Universal Postal Union was created in order to allow letters to be sent from one country to another. And that involved a fair amount of cooperation. And both these organizations exist today, except the ITU is now the International Telecommunications Union, and both of them are located in Switzerland. But the plan of 1815 fell miserably, and the concert of Europe was not able to prevent a war that started with the shot that rang around the world. That is the shot by a Black Hand member in Sarajevo of the Archduke Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the throne. And this launched World War I as one nation after another decided they had to come to the aid of other countries they had secret treaties with. And so the balance of power system actually failed catastrophically, as the nations were unable to prevent war, despite the fact that Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas were cousins. And they had a famous correspondence between Nicky and Willie. But despite the fact that they didn't want their nations to go to war, the machinery was already there through this web of secret treaties and alliances. So we saw a catastrophic war in Europe, which you can look at as having had the main causes of militarism, whereby the militaries in their societies, in their countries, were given such prestige that once they mobilized and the military structures wanted to go to war, there was little that even the leaders, the emperors, could do. There were these secret alliances by which one nation was automatically at war if another nation were attacked. Then there was imperialism, this drive for greater power and greater territory. And of course, nationalism, which allowed the leaders to say that they were acting not in their own selfish interest, but in the interest of the nation. There wasn't a broader humanism. And so that match in Sarajevo was able to light the fire after we had an arms race and these strong national movements. It was able to light the fire that burned so brightly in the First World War from 1914 to 1919. Oh, sorry, till 1918, 4 years of war. This also saw the use of chemical weapons on a mass scale where tens of thousands died when chlorine gas and sulfur mustard gases were spread across the battlefield in order to overcome the problem of the trenches. A very inhuman way of dying. And when Europe looked at what had happened, they could hardly claim to be the model of civilization in this catastrophic war. And the United States was very hesitant to enter into the war, seeing this catastrophe in Europe. But eventually, the US President Woodrow Wilson decided that he had to get involved in war, and that it wasn't just a war to help one side or the other. This was a war to help end wars. And he made proposals, including the 14 points for freedom of the seas, open covenants openly arrived at, for freer trade, for the consent of the governed, self-determination. And the 14th point was a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small nations alike. These were the war aims of the United States government. And so when the guns finally fell silent on November 11th, 1918, the peace plan that was accepted by the Germans was to be based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. And the Allies gathered in Paris to prepare a document to be signed by Germany and all other states to resolve the issues of World War I and to be able to create a foundation for future peace. But one leader, which was Clemenceau, the Premier of France, he wanted a repressive regime in which Germany would be pushed down with and burdened with so much reparations that they could not even afford to pay. In this way, it would be keeping Germany down so it couldn't rise again and attack France. Whereas Lloyd George was more interested, the Prime Minister of England, was more interested in preserving the British Empire. And Woodrow Wilson had this idealistic approach of creating a new League of Nations, whereby there would be commitments that when one nation was attacked, the other nations would come to its aid. And the three debated their different points of view. And at one point, Clemenceau was a little frustrated that Wilson wasn't willing to give in with his punitive approach to Germany. So Clemenceau said, "I'm tired of Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points. God himself has only 10. And then he said, Lloyd George, what he really wants to be is Napoleon. And Woodrow Wilson, he wants to be Jesus Christ." But Wilson did manage to get through the Covenant of the League of Nations to negotiated in about 3 weeks in the first few months of 1919. And it formed the basis of the Treaty of Versailles, along with the punitive measures that France had insisted in. So in the Treaty of Versailles, signed in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, we saw the end of empires in Europe, the end of the Ottoman Empire, the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the empires outside of Europe, the colonial conquest, still remained, although Germany had to give up its colonies. The realism of France faced the liberalism of the United States, and both provisions were included in the treaty. Unfortunately, in the United States, Woodrow Wilson was unable to get the Treaty of Versailles passed by the US Senate. The senior senator from Massachusetts, Henry Cabot Lodge, made a series of amendments and reservations so that the treaty could not be accepted outright and it couldn't be accepted with amendments. And this narrow-minded nationalism prevailed so that the United States never joined the League of Nations, despite its founder being a US president. But the League of Nations was created, it was established in Geneva, and it did have a number of successes, though the United States was on the outside looking in. The successes of the League include the resolving disputes between Finland and Sweden over the Åland Islands, between Germany and Poland over Upper Silesia, which involved a plebiscite or a vote of the people according to Wilsonian principles of self-determination, dispute over Memel in Lithuania, and Turkey in a major humanitarian effort by the League in 1923, and preventing a war in 1925 between Greece and Bulgaria. And war prevention was so key because people knew that one war could start many others. In fact, the League even administered the territory of the Saar for 15 years until a referendum was held and the Saar people decided to join with Germany. But the League had major failures in the 1930s. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, it took over a year for the League even to produce a report of the Lytton Commission to state that this had been aggression by Japan. By that time, Japan had already solidified its conquest of Manchuria. Then Mussolini invaded Abyssinia, current-day Ethiopia, in 1935. Then Hitler marched into the Rhineland in 1936, and Stalin invaded Finland in 1939. And the most that the League could do was condemn these attacks, kick the Soviet Union out of the League of Nations, and by that time, Germany had already left the League of Nations. And it responded to a plea from the Emperor of Abyssinia, Haile Selassie. In 1936, he said, should it happen that a strong government finds it may, with impunity, destroy a weak people, then the hour strikes for that weak people to appeal to the League of Nations to give its judgment in all freedom. God and history will remember your judgment. And then he said something quite prophetic. It is us today, it will be you tomorrow. Now, the League of Nations did try to put oil sanctions on Mussolini. In fact, those initial movements were led by Canada. But Canada was a very ambivalent member of the League. Its neighbor to the south had never joined. And as a Canadian representative said in the League of Nations Assembly in 1924, in this association of mutual insurance against fire, the risks assumed by different states are not equal. We, in Canada, live in a fireproof house far from inflammable materials. Although the inflammable materials did ignite the Canadian house and we lost tens of thousands in the coming war, the attitude of the separation of Europe from North America by ocean and by difference in involvement meant that Canada could not support even the sanctions that it had proposed against Mussolini. Although Mussolini later on said that if the League had actually implemented those sanctions, then he would not have been able to continue his attack on Abyssinia. So World War II came upon us in September 1939 when Germany attacked Poland, and Russia and Germany already had an agreement to divide up Poland. And the tragedy of all this is that the League of Nations was impotent to be able to prevent this attack and to be able to take action. And Japan soon attacked the United States. The US was at war, and the war ended after German surrender in May 1945 and Japanese surrender after the dropping of the 2 nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. Now, towards the end of the war, the US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided that we needed to do something to create a stronger system of global governance. We need a stronger system of international security. And he took the model that Wilson had proposed, the League of Nations model, and started to build upon it. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt had actually been Assistant Secretary of the Navy, appointed by Woodrow Wilson in World War I, and had seen all the challenges of World War I and the subsequent efforts to create a League of Nations. So he wanted to build on something better, but rather than establish a whole new system, they decided to refine the system that was in the League of Nations. So we went from the first generation of International Organization for Peace to the second generation. The League of Nations Covenant formed the basis of the provisions of the UN Charter. That included an assembly in the UN called the General Assembly, which took over from the League of Nations Assembly. Included a Security Council, which took over from the League Council. Included a Trusteeship Council, which took over from the League Mandates Commission to oversee decolonization. And we saw the Permanent Court of International Justice become the International Court of Justice under the same statute, and still located in The Hague. The headquarters of the new institution was put in New York, and all the properties of the League in Geneva were made properties of the United Nations. And so today, the European headquarters of the United Nations is in Geneva at the Palais des Nations, with the Wilson sphere shown here in front of the main building at the Palais des Nations. Now, the tradition continued as well of having a Secretary General. The first League Secretary General established an impartial international civil service. Sir Eric Drummond had come from the British Civil Service and had the principle that the Secretary General should not operate according to some nations or some standards of some nations, but according to universal standards. That he should be a servant of all, just like the British civil servants are servants of the government, not of a party. So Trygve Lie took that same principle as the first UN Secretary General and established the UN International Civil Service, which he led with great aplomb, and which he used to strengthen the office of the Secretary General. Now, what about the United States government? Well, ironically, the grandson of Henry Cabot Lodge was now the senator from Massachusetts, and Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. made sure that the Republicans did not, in 1945, subvert the UN Charter, and he worked so that there was to be agreement among all parties. So we had a bipartisan agreement to the UN Charter, and subsequently he was appointed as ambassador of the United States to the UN by General Eisenhower, or President Eisenhower at the time, and here he is presenting his credentials to the UN Secretary General, the second UN Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld. The UN also grew in a number of agencies. So not just the UPU, which you see in Bern in the middle of this, top middle of this diagram, but you also have other agencies, including one in Canada, the International Civil Aviation Organization. You have the development of UN Development Program. You have the Bretton Woods institutions located in Washington, D.C. You have regional economic commissions in different parts of the world. And Geneva grew in terms of the number of organizations, including the High Commissioner for Refugees, High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the World Health Organization, which currently plays such an important role in dealing with the problem of the pandemic today. Now, in terms of UN achievements, there were many, including the drafting by a Canadian of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it was adopted by a committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, President of the United States' wife, who shepherded it through and gained endorsement. Another major achievement was the first invocation and application of collective security, not collective defense, but collective security by the nations of the world. When North Korea was attacked on June 24th, 1950, by the forces of when South Korea was attacked by the forces of North Korea, then the United Nations gathered in the Security Council, which the Soviet Union was boycotting at the time and was unable to apply its veto, to a measure that called for the creation of a UN command to help the nations of the world and to defend South Korea against naked aggression. And this led to substantial contributions from the United States and 16 other countries in which that aggression was actually repelled. And over a period of 3 years, we saw that the security of South Korea was assured. Another major development involving Canada was the creation in 1956 of the UN's first peacekeeping forces, the first time that international organization and the Secretary General, seen here as Dag Hammarskjöld, had armed forces under operational control of the Secretary General. This was a proposal that was made by Lester Pearson in 1956 to end the Suez Crisis, to replace the Israeli, French, and British troops that had invaded Egypt with UN forces that would oversee their withdrawal. And for that initiative to end the Suez Crisis, the Nobel Peace Prize was given to Pearson in 1957. And we saw a continuous evolution of peacekeeping from the early observers, which had existed prior to 1956, to the interposed forces, which existed after 1956, where the forces stood between two warring armies in order to prevent them from attacking each other. And then after the end of the Cold War, in a large expansion into multidimensional modern peacekeeping, where not only were militaries deployed, armed militaries, but you had leadership by political players, especially namely the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General, or SRSG. You had humanitarians as part of the mission. You had UNPOL, UN police, economic actors, social actors to bring warring factions together. They had to do reconstruction and creating judicial mechanisms so that the warring factions could go to courts rather than take their disputes to the streets and fight with each other. And this resulted in many peace operations, over 70 of them, of which there are 14 today. And so not only were peace operations important, but so were the judicial mechanisms. And to help bring justice to those who had been victimized in the wars in the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was created in 1993, and a similar one was created in 1994 for those to prosecute those who committed crimes in Rwanda. And then finally, in 1998, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court created a permanent international court. And this was a major step forward, whereby leaders of nations who were signatory or nations that had been designated by the Security Council, that even leaders of nations were not immune from prosecution. And so the ICC has actually brought in former leaders of nations for prosecution in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So that's a review of tremendous progress in human history, but that doesn't mean that we've achieved the goals. We still have these challenges of today. Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, China's crushing of dissent in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, namely the Uyghurs, the Myanmar military coup and the killing of protesters, and the Syrian government's crushing of rebellion in large swaths of Syria. The UN has proven just too weak, and states are not committed enough to making the UN work. International law is not enforced, and here we see cases where power overrides principle. So we have these disasters where civilians are dying in these catastrophic situations, and the world is not powerful enough to do things about it. In addition, we have new transnational problems, so-called problems without passports, like the pandemic that spreads across national lines, or climate change, which threatens our planet as a whole. We have the huge challenge of economic recovery and underdevelopment in large parts of the world, particularly after the pandemic, as we tried to build back better. And of course, war itself is a transnational challenge, because when one people are attacked It's actually an affront to our human dignity of all of us. So we can conclude that these global problems require global solutions, and that some progress has been made already, with 2 generations of international organizations already being formed. Well, what can we do to make improvements upon this, to form greater global solutions? Well, here are some major steps. The world could create a parliamentary assembly, whereby decisions could be made by members of parliaments brought in from different countries who are members of the UN, and they meet, say, in the General Assembly Hall, and they make decisions about world problems. So we actually have beginning to have a transnational body that deals with international, transnational problems. We can have new seats in the Security Council to deal with new members who should be given seats, rotating seats, or perhaps even permanent seats, so that it's more representative of the world today. We should put limits on the veto and create limits on enforcement if enforcement is being abused, and then creating mechanisms to allow enforcement to go through without the veto or without the restrictions that have made it so difficult, for instance, to deal with situations like Syria. And we should have the International Court of Justice review decisions of the UN Security Council, so that we can make sure that there are checks and balances on that power. I would propose that the Secretariat have revamped election procedures for the Secretary General, which is already happening, that there be some sort of global open skies agreement to create transparency so that the UN could fly surveillance planes over different areas to monitor any potential troop buildups or violations of accords. And the UN should develop a greatly improved early warning system. So that would be building upon the 2nd generation of international organization, which is what we have. Currently, the 2nd generation IO is the United Nations, whereby the executive branch of each nation sends representatives to the General Assembly and the Security Council, and the executive branch, through the votes in the General Assembly and its nominations to the International Court of Justice, as a mechanism for providing judges to the ICJ. What I see in the future is a 3rd generation international organization. Now, this is something in coming decades or centuries. A 3rd generation organization would have a legislative component, a parliamentary assembly, whereby the legislatures elect members of the parliamentary assembly. The executive will appoint their ambassadors to a World Council and also elect the Secretary General, which would also involve a legislative component. And the judicial courts would send representatives to the International Court. And that this court would have jurisdiction not only over nations, as it currently does, those nations which have signed up to it, but also over individuals. So we begin to have the increasing responsibility of individuals for their actions, not just nations. So with this generation, a new generation, we have at least a hope, a chance for a safer world. And we can hope that the world can actually evolve so that global security is for all of us. We are, in fact, one planet. We are one human race, and that we need to recognize that we need rules to protect all human beings wherever they are. I thank you for your attention in this presentation, and I'd say this is just the end of the beginning of global governance of security. Thank you very much.